They set him on fire, tied him up and walked away because he was too slow, too old, too broken to fight anymore. But what they didn't know was that someone else was watching. It happened in a back alley no one cared about, between a crumbling warehouse and a stretch of dead weeds, where the city forgot to send street cleaners and humanity forgot to look. They had brought him there in the trunk of a rusted van, 3 men, drunk on power and liquor, laughing like it was nothing. The dog, once called Champion, had spent his entire life chained in a yard behind a fighting ring. He had scars older than most puppies ever lived to be. One eye was milky with damage, the other filled with something worse than pain: confusion. He didn't fight back when they kicked him, didn't snarl when they poured the gasoline. He just looked up, his one good eye locking with the man holding the match. There was no hatred in his face, just a question: why? And then flames. The alley lit up in a hiss and crackle, skin blistered, fur blackened. The rope tightened around his neck as he thrashed instinctively, legs buckling beneath a body already betrayed too many times. The men watched for a few seconds. Then one of them spat on the ground and muttered, "Not worth the bullets," and they turned and left. But what they didn't see, what they never saw, was the pair of eyes watching from the dumpster across the street. A boy, thin, silent, forgotten in his own ways. He had come looking for scraps. Instead, he found a soul burning. He waited until the van's taillights were gone. Then he ran, not away, toward the smell of burning hair, toward the heat, toward the creature no one else had bothered to save. The dog was still alive, barely. The boy didn't scream, didn't cry. He just took off his threadbare hoodie and smothered the fire, ignoring the pain as it seared his fingers. He whispered, "I'm sorry," again and again, like a prayer that had never worked before, but might this time. The dog didn't move, but he also didn't die. Not yet. The boy's name was Luis. He was 14, small for his age and mostly invisible in a city that didn't notice the lost. He lived 2 blocks away in an abandoned laundromat with a busted vending machine and a roof that leaked when it rained. No parents, no social worker, just silence, and the occasional sound of his own heartbeat when things got too quiet. When he carried the dog back wrapped in the remains of his hoodie, his arms shook, not from the weight, but from fear. The kind that comes when you know something fragile has chosen not to die, and that you might be the only reason why. He didn't have a phone, didn't call a vet. He didn't trust people in coats with clipboards and clean shoes. Instead, he laid the dog down on a pile of old towels he used as a bed. His fingers were blistered, his eyes stung from smoke. But he never left the dog's side. Not for water, not for food, not even when the dog whimpered in his sleep, flinching from pain only he could see. He named him Ghost, because for 2 days that's what he looked like, a shadow barely tethered to life. The burns were worst on his back and side. Raw skin covered in layers of gauze Luis had stolen from a half-abandoned pharmacy. The dog's breathing was shallow. Every few hours, Luis would wet a cloth with cool water and whisper, "It's okay. You're safe now," like he believed it would help. Maybe it did. On the 3rd day, Ghost lifted his head, only an inch, only for a second. But it was enough. Luis smiled for the first time in months. What he didn't know was that across the city, a volunteer named Ava was filing through police reports. She worked nights at an overcrowded rescue shelter, underpaid, overwhelmed, but relentless. And when a tip came in about a dog being torched alive near Harbor Street, something in her snapped. She had seen cruelty. She thought she'd built armor. But this was different. She drove out to the alley herself, ignoring protocol. The ashes were still there. Rope fibers fused into charred concrete, scattered teeth, and the smell. God, the smell still lingered. She took a photo. She posted it, not for clout, for war. The post went viral in hours. This was done to a dog. Someone thought this was okay. This is what happens when animals are treated like property. Within 48 hours, Eva's inbox was flooded. Messages from strangers, veterinarians offering help, former fighters sharing anonymous tips, and one photo, grainy, taken from a distance, of a boy carrying a burned dog wrapped in a hoodie. Luis. They didn't know his name yet, but they would. Back in the laundromat, Ghost was healing. Slowly. He still flinched at sudden movements. Still whimpered when he smelled fire. Real or imagined. But he followed Luis now. Not with the frantic energy of a rescued puppy, but with the heavy loyalty of something that had died and come back different. Luis began stealing less food and more medicine. He learned how to boil water without burning it. He read labels on ointments. He made friends with a cashier who looked the other way. Every night, Ghost would fall asleep with his head pressed against Luis's thigh. Every morning, Luis would whisper, "You're not trash," and Ghost would blink once, like he understood. Then came the knock. 3 firm taps on a door that barely hung on its hinges. Luis froze. Ghost growled, a low, broken sound like thunder inside a collapsing cave. Eva stood outside. She didn't have a badge. She didn't yell. She simply said, "I think you saved someone, and I think we want to help." Luis didn't speak at first. He didn't trust easily. But Ghost walked forward, not limping, not afraid, and that was enough. Now the world knew his name, not the name the men had branded on his cage, not champion, not asset. His name was Ghost, and he was not done. Because survival is not the end of the story. It's the beginning of a different one. Ghost didn't just recover, he transformed, slowly, not into what he once was, but into what he had never been allowed to be, gentle. At the shelter Eva worked in, they had seen hundreds of abused dogs, some too scared to eat, others too broken to trust again. But Ghost, he didn't cower, he didn't lash out. He watched, measured, waited. His movements were careful, deliberate, like he had memorized what pain looked like and didn't want anyone else to feel it. Luis came with him every day. At first, Eva worried the boy might disappear, that he'd run once the authorities got involved. But Luis didn't run. He stayed. And the bond between him and Ghost, scars and all, was undeniable. When the vet approached Ghost with a syringe, the dog flinched. But when Luis touched his ear and said, "You're okay," Ghost didn't even blink. That kind of trust couldn't be trained. It had to be earned. With blood, with fire, with presence. The rescue center had never dealt with a case like this. News outlets kept calling. Offers came in from adoption agencies. One family from out of state offered $10,000 for Ghost. "He's famous now," they said. "He deserves a good home." Eva looked at Luis. He didn't answer. He just wrapped his arms around Ghost's neck and whispered, "He already has one." And that was the end of that. Eva helped Luis apply for legal foster status. It wasn't easy. There were court visits, paperwork, a CPS worker who kept asking, "Where were your parents again?" Luis answered every question with the same hollow shrug. "Gone." But when the caseworker met Ghost and saw how he curled himself around Luis like a shield, something in her eyes softened. She stopped asking about parents, started asking about future plans. Luis didn't know what he wanted to be, but he knew what he didn't want to be. He didn't want to become one of them, the men who burned things they no longer needed, the ones who called animals property, the ones who thought silence was obedience and fear was loyalty. He wanted to build something else, something quieter, stronger, kinder, and Ghost would be at the center of it. One afternoon, Eva brought them to a classroom. A local elementary school had invited them to speak. "Just tell them what happened," she said, "the parts you're ready to share." Luis didn't want to. He didn't like microphones or being looked at, but Ghost walked to the front of the room like he belonged there. And when a child raised his hand and asked, "Is he still scared?" Luis answered, "Sometimes, but he knows what safe feels like now, so he can tell the difference." The room went quiet, and in that quiet something shifted, not just in the children, in Luis. Because sometimes healing isn't just about surviving the fire, it's about becoming the one who walks others out of it. And that's exactly what they began to do. Eva had an idea, a quiet one at first. A series of short community talks, visits to youth shelters, maybe even a collaboration with local animal control to speak to schools. "You don't have to say much," she told Luis. "Just show up. Sometimes just being in the room changes everything." Luis agreed, not because he wanted to be known, but because he knew what it felt like to be unseen. They started small, an after-school center in the roughest part of the city, a dozen kids who pretended not to care, who kicked chairs and chewed gum and rolled their eyes. But when Ghost walked in, slow, scarred, calm, they stopped, every one of them. And when Luis told the story, just enough of it, they didn't laugh or talk back. They just watched the dog, the one who had been burned alive, the one who should have hated every human in that room, but didn't, because Ghost didn't walk in with fear. He walked in with presence, and sometimes presence is louder than pain. News spread again, but this time it wasn't about what was done to Ghost. It was about what he had become, a survivor, a symbol, a friend to kids who had been beaten by parents, locked in closets, left behind in systems that moved too fast and asked too little. And next to him, always, was Luis, the quiet boy with the steady hands and the watchful eyes. He didn't speak much. He didn't have to, because Ghost always went where Luis went, and Luis always made sure Ghost had water, shade, and a soft blanket to lie on, even if it meant giving up his own. It didn't go unnoticed, not by the kids, not by the shelters, not by the people who had once looked away. One morning, Ava found a letter taped to the shelter door. No name, no return address. Inside was a photo of a chained pit bull behind a rusted gate, and one sentence, scrawled in messy handwriting, "If Ghost made it, maybe she can too." That week, they rescued the dog. The following month, 3 more. And by the end of the year, they had helped nearly 24 animals survive, and even more kids begin to heal. Not through speeches, not through therapy, but through witness, through Ghost, through Luis. And still, neither of them liked the word hero. Luis once said, "He's not a hero, he's just proof that cruelty doesn't get the last word." Ava added, "Maybe that's all any of us need to be." A quiet contradiction to what the world expects. A scarred dog that chooses stillness. A quiet boy who stays. And somehow that had become their legacy, not built on rescue headlines or stage moments, but on consistency, on showing up, on being the ones who didn't flinch when others looked away. It was the stillness that made people listen, the refusal to make pain into a spectacle, the refusal to turn survival into a brand. At the city shelter, the staff began calling Luis and Ghost the pair, not out of habit but out of quiet respect. They were the ones who could walk into a room with a dog too damaged for anyone else to touch, and just sit, for hours if needed. Sometimes the dog wouldn't even look at them. Sometimes it would growl or shake or retreat into a corner. Luis would sit anyway. Ghost would lie down beside him, and they would wait. Some of the staff asked how he did it. Luis didn't explain. How could he? How could you teach someone to understand a silence born from fire? How could you tell people that sometimes presence was more important than words, and that the ones who had been broken the worst often listened with their bodies, not their ears? So he didn't explain. He just kept coming back, and Ghost kept following. When local government officials visited the shelter for a media day, they expected photo ops. What they found was a boy with a soft voice and an old hoodie, tending to a dog with clouded eyes and pink scars. No one posed. No one smiled for the cameras. But one of the visitors, a councilwoman who had lost her son to a street overdose, watched them for a long time. Later, she pulled Eva aside. "Are they real?" she asked. "Like, do they always act like that?" Eva answered, "They don't act at all. That's the difference." The shelter got a funding boost 2 weeks later. No one officially said why. But Luis noticed that the food bowls were always full now, that the crates got cleaned more often, that someone fixed the roof that always leaked in the corner room. He didn't say thank you. He just stayed longer. Ghost grew older. His steps slowed. His eyes grayed. The burns on his side faded into leathery patches of skin that no longer hurt to touch. But he still rose every morning when Luis did, still walked beside him when they made their rounds, still pressed his head into the legs of crying teenagers like a soldier who had learned to walk silently into the worst rooms and carry pain out without a sound. One afternoon, Luis was sitting with a boy named Riley, new to the shelter, angry, eyes full of loss. He had kicked a door off its hinges the night before, had punched a wall so hard his knuckles bled. Ghost walked up to him slowly and placed his head in Riley's lap. The boy didn't move. Then he burst into tears. Eva watched from the hallway and whispered to herself, "We didn't save him, he saved us." Because sometimes healing doesn't look like a miracle, it looks like repetition. Like a scarred dog walking the same hallway every morning, pressing his head into different hands, reminding broken people that they are not alone. Ghost did it without a leash, without commands, without expectation. He simply went where pain was and stayed. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was holy. Soon other shelters started calling. "Can Luis and Ghost visit? We have a case no one can get through to. There's a boy who hasn't spoken in a week." Luis never said no, not because he felt responsible, but because he remembered what it felt like, lying in the dark, cold and hungry, thinking no one was coming. He remembered the silence right before the fire, and he remembered the breath that came after, the one that said, "I'm not leaving." So he and Ghost went, to the group homes with metal doors, to the hospitals with locked wings, to the alley behind the old warehouse, where it had all started. They stood there one rainy morning, Luis older now, taller, quieter in a more intentional way. Ghost beside him, slower but still sharp-eyed. Luis knelt in the wet gravel and whispered, "This is where you should have died." Ghost didn't flinch. He leaned into Luis's shoulder and closed his eyes. And that's when Luis knew. They had turned the ugliest place in the city into sacred ground. Back at the shelter, they painted a mural, not of fire, not of chains, but of a dog, eyes lifted, surrounded by hands, small hands, bruised hands, trembling hands, all reaching toward him not to take, but to thank. At the bottom in a child's handwriting were 5 simple words. He didn't bark, he stayed. Those 5 words spread faster than any headline ever could. They were printed on flyers by the local rescue network, painted on the side of a traveling adoption van, written in chalk on the sidewalks outside animal shelters. The words didn't need explanation. People saw Ghost's image, and they understood. Because in a world that screamed, that demanded attention with noise and spectacle, this dog had survived the unspeakable and chosen to offer silence in return. Not as indifference, but as presence, the kind that doesn't ask, doesn't explain, doesn't fix, just is. Luis was invited to speak at a youth summit. He didn't want to go. The word summit felt too polished, too adult, too much like a stage. But Eva said, "You don't have to perform, just bring him." So Luis and Ghost sat at the back of the auditorium until it was their turn. When their names were called, Luis walked to the front with his head down and his palms sweaty. Ghost trotted slowly behind him, still favoring his left leg, a permanent limp that reminded everyone watching. Some damage never goes away. Luis didn't open with a speech. He knelt beside Ghost, placed a hand on his back, and looked at the audience. Then he said, "This dog was supposed to die. He was supposed to be trash, but someone stayed long enough for him to live. And now, that's what we do. We stay. No applause, no cheering, just stillness, the kind that settles into your chest and stays there long after the lights go down." A week later, a girl came into the shelter alone. She couldn't have been older than 15. She didn't speak, just held out a phone with a screenshot, the mural, the words. He didn't bark, he stayed. Then she pointed to the intake room and whispered, "I have someone in the car. He needs someone to stay." Eva rushed outside. In the back seat was a trembling, half-starved mutt with ribs showing and a chain still locked around its neck. They named him Ash. Ghost took to Ash immediately. No dominance, no barking. Just a slow walk across the room, a soft sniff, a circle, and a shared bed that night. Luis watched it all unfold with tears he didn't try to hide, because he knew, without needing proof, that the work would never be done. There would always be another one, another Ash, another boy, another alley, another moment where someone could choose to look away or stay. And they did. Through winter storms, when the pipes in the shelter burst and Luis spent nights bailing out cold water with buckets while Ghost lay curled in a dry corner, refusing to leave until every animal had been moved. Through summer heat waves when Eva begged Luis to take a break, but he insisted on staying because the dogs don't get a vacation. Through riots that rattled the city and funding cuts that nearly closed the doors for good, Ghost stayed. Luis stayed. And in their staying, something extraordinary happened. The shelter changed, not just in structure, but in spirit. Kids who had been bounced from one foster home to another started volunteering there. Not because they had to, but because they said it was the only place they didn't feel like a problem. Teens who had been expelled from school came to wash bowls, clean crates, and, most importantly, sit. Just sit. Next to animals who didn't care about grades or behavior reports, animals like Ghost, like Ash, like all the others who had arrived with eyes that didn't make contact and left with tails that did. People came from other cities to ask, "How did you do this?" And Eva always gave the same answer. "We didn't. They did." She'd nod toward Luis, older now, leaner, quieter, always listening before speaking, and toward Ghost, his back grayer, his steps slower, but his presence undiminished. Then came the day no one wanted to talk about. Ghost was tired. He still rose when Luis did, but it took longer now. His legs wobbled on slippery floors. He stopped climbing stairs. He stopped eating as much. The vet said it was coming soon. Luis didn't ask how long. He just sat beside him more often and told him stories he'd already told 100 times. About the night they met, about Ash, about the kids, about how many lives had changed because one dog refused to give up. Ghost listened. He always had. And when that final morning came, Ghost didn't whimper. He didn't shake. He laid his head on Luis's foot and looked up one last time. One eye cloudy, the other still sharp enough to see the boy he had saved. And then, stillness. Not silence. Stillness. The kind that stays long after the body is gone. The kind that becomes memory, movement, meaning. And Ghost did become all three. The mural outside the shelter was repainted, this time not just with his face, but with dozens of others. Ash, the chained pit bull. Kira, the blind retriever who had once bitten every hand but Luis's. Even a little chihuahua named Moose, who used to cry himself to sleep until Ghost curled around him like a blanket. Luis added one final image, small and almost hidden in the lower corner. A boy no older than 14, sitting cross-legged in a burned alley, holding a hoodie to a wounded dog's body. It wasn't art, it was a memory that wouldn't let go, and maybe wasn't supposed to. Ghost was buried behind the shelter beneath a tree that bloomed only in spring. Luis dug the hole himself. He didn't allow a crowd, no media, no speeches, just Eva, Ash, and silence. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything had already been said. In the years Ghost had walked those halls, in the lives he'd touched without a single bark, in the stories that no one had the words for, so they told them in presence instead. After that, something shifted. Luis still showed up every morning, still sat with the fearful, the snarling, the shaking. But now others began to follow his lead. Teens who had once stood in the doorway, unsure of whether they belonged, now walked in with leashes in hand, whispering, "I've got this one." They started calling themselves the quiet ones. Not as an insult, as a vow, to listen, to witness, to stay. Eva watched it all unfold like watching fire turn into light instead of ash. She kept the original flyer in her desk drawer, the one with the headline, "Dog Burned Alive for No Longer Being Useful." But someone had crossed it out with pen. Below it, in Luis's handwriting, was a new headline. "He never stopped being needed." Those words didn't just live in Eva's drawer. They made their way onto the shelter's front gate, carved in reclaimed wood by one of the volunteers who used to sleep in his car. They were printed on t-shirts, handed out at community events. A rescue team in another state saw the photo and painted the words across their mobile unit. It wasn't a slogan, it was a standard, because Ghost hadn't just survived cruelty. He had rewritten what it meant to be loyal, to stay not out of fear or command, but choice. And Luis had become the kind of person who didn't need to say a word to lead a movement. He just kept showing up. One morning, nearly 2 years after Ghost's passing, Luis was standing beside a new intake, a terrified mutt with crusted sores and a deep fear of hands. A teenage girl stood awkwardly beside him, unsure what to do. "She won't even look at me," she muttered. Luis didn't speak. He simply knelt and waited. The girl hesitated, then followed. For 20 minutes, they said nothing. The dog finally lifted her head, and that was it. Later that day, the girl came back with 3 words written on her forearm in black ink. "He stayed. I will." Luis didn't say anything when he saw it, but he smiled. And in that small curve of his mouth was every word Ghost had ever needed to speak, but never had to. Eva began collecting stories like that. Notes, emails, anonymous letters. "I didn't give up because of him. My son talks now because of your dog. I named my baby Ghost. I went back for the dog I left behind." Luis never asked to read them. He said, "They're not for me." Eva said, "No, but they're because of you." And that was enough. Luis didn't argue. He didn't shrug like he used to, when praise felt like a burden. He simply nodded once and kept working. He knew by now that true impact didn't need recognition. Ghost had taught him that. The shelter's waiting list began to grow. Not for animals needing rescue, but for kids asking to volunteer. Not because it looked good on college applications, because it felt like home, because it was the first place they'd ever entered without being judged by what they brought with them, or what they lacked. They came with broken phones, foster files, parole officers, and old pain. They left with dog hair on their jeans and names whispered into warm fur. Luis trained them quietly. He didn't run orientations. He didn't give motivational speeches. He just said, "Come sit with me," and let the dogs do the rest. He showed them how to move slowly, how to breathe evenly, how to let a wounded creature make the first move. And he reminded them, without ever saying it outright, that love wasn't earned, it was allowed. Ash was older now too. He had become something of a sentinel, still watchful, but softer. He no longer flinched at the sound of metal gates or the screech of mop buckets. Instead, he watched the new dogs, positioned himself between them and fear. Sometimes he even herded the nervous ones toward Luis like he was saying, "This is where you go when it hurts." And Luis always made space, even when he was tired, even when the pain of missing Ghost came back like a bruise that never quite faded. He stayed, because someone once stayed for him. They hung a photo in the intake room. It wasn't of Ghost at his strongest. It was him lying next to a trembling puppy, eyes half closed, one paw gently placed on the puppy's back. Underneath, a brass plaque read, "Presence is stronger than pain." And those who knew the story felt it. Those who didn't learned it, one quiet visit at a time. Years later, people still asked about him. They'd come into the shelter holding worn-out photos or pointing to the mural outside and say, "Was that the real dog? The one from the story?" And Luis would nod, not because he needed to relive it, but because the truth deserved to breathe. Sometimes they'd ask to see where he was buried. Luis would walk them to the tree behind the building, the one that bloomed only in spring. By then, the plaque had faded and the flowers had been replanted a dozen times. But the stillness there, the hush in the air, never changed. And when they stood in front of that tree, most people didn't speak. They didn't need to, because Ghost had taught them what silence could hold. Pain, yes, but also loyalty, grace, forgiveness, and the kind of presence that didn't need permission to heal. Luis never left the shelter. Not really. He worked fewer shifts as he grew older, mentored more kids, trained new volunteers, built partnerships with other sanctuaries. But every evening before closing, he'd sit in the same corner of the back room, Ash at his feet, and journal. Not about numbers, or funding, or logistics, about moments. The way a dog finally let someone touch its paw. The way a kid who hadn't spoken in weeks whispered, "Good boy," to a 3-legged mutt. The way pain softened, not all at once, but gradually, like frost retreating under morning light. One night, Eva found a letter on her desk. No envelope, no signature, just folded paper, left carefully beneath her mug. It read, "I used to think no one would ever stay. Now I know better, because he did, and I did, and they will." That was how legacy worked, she realized. Not in monuments, not in headlines, but in repetition. In the boy who stayed, in the dog who never ran, in every quiet person who sat beside suffering and refused to look away. And somewhere beneath spring blossoms, in the hush between breath and memory, in the hearts of those who had been broken but not discarded, Ghost was still there, not barking, just staying. He didn't bark. He stayed. If this story moved you, don't let it stop here. Share it. Speak up for the voiceless. And when the world turns away from something broken, be the one who stays.